Especially since this paper deals with fantasy representations of indigenous people, I would like to acknowledge the Lenape people, the traditional owners of the land on which I live now. I am now going to share my screen. The Lossoth, Indigeneity, Representation, and Antiracism. In Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings, we are told that Arvedui, the last king of the line of Valandil in the north, takes refuge from the Witch King and the collapse of his own kingdom of Arthedain in Third Age 1974 with the Lossoth. The Lossoth, described as the snowmen of Foreshell, are northern polar area indigenous people clearly modeled on the Inuit, Sami, or Nenets. David Day says of the Lossoth, they built their homes from snow, and in sliding carts and skates of bone, they crossed the icelands and hunted the thick-furred animals from which they fashioned their clothes. Robert Foster, in his Guide to Middle-earth, describes the Lossoth as primitive and poor, and both these are commentators sifting from the evidence that Tolkien provides in Appendix A. The Lossoth take in Arvedui and his men after the defeat by the Witch King, partly out of pity and partly out of fear. Arvedui lives in a short time in harmony and mutual assistance with the Lossoth. He even gives them the heirloom of his house, the Ring of Barahir, recognizing that they are kin enough to receive this ancient symbol of the Edain. Arvedui is able to be intersectional, at least temporarily, and recognize the racial diversity of Middle-earth, that people not phenotypically white, in Eliza Farrell's words, can contribute their own worth. That the Lossoth know and feel situated in their own physical environment in a way Arvedui does not, and he has wisdom to seek help from them, help save his life. Arvedui, though, does not ultimately heed the advice of the Lossoth not to board the ship that will take him back south. The unnamed chief of the Lossoth says, do not mount on the sea monster. If they have them, let the seamen bring us food and other things that we need, and you may stay here till the Witch King goes home. For in summer his power wanes, but now his breath is deadly, and his cold arm is long. But Arvedui does not listen and dies in a shipwreck in Third Age 1975. Arvedui's poignant story is ultimately mobilized into the genealogy of Aragorn's kingship and a Númenórean restoration, paralleling how the indigeneity of the Lossoth is reinscribed into an avatar of colonialism rather than being valued for itself. The story of the Lossoth reveals the tantalizing potential of diversity in Tolkien's represented world and a corollary tendency for conventional valuations of whiteness and hierarchy to obdurately reassert themselves. Yet, as in the cognate role played by the people of Ghân-buri-Ghân in the War of the Ring, the momentary appearance of the Lossoth is still meaningful. This is particularly so as they are geographically positioned at the extreme north and west of Middle-earth, the two compass points that Tolkien elsewhere values as an analog for his own Europe. I contend that the Lossoth intermittently and incompletely operate as an internal brake upon Eurocentrism, and as an indicator that resistance to evil cannot be channeled through one model of identity, belonging, or power. Tolkien takes the Lossoth out of what might be called an axiological binary, a dyad of value, as they are clearly not evil, even if they live in what was once a part of Morgoth's northern torch realm of Angband. Indeed, the Lossoth, as we have said, do their best to help Arvedui, and the limits of the help they could give him are also the limits of the Arthedain king's cultural sensitivity. But the Lossoth are still in an anthropological binary, as they are seen as, despite having their own intuitive wisdom, less noble and consequential than Arvedui and his kind. What did Tolkien actually know about northern indigenous people? John Garth sees the aid to Arvedui and his men, given by the Warre Lossoth, as being reminiscent of the interaction of the Arctic Inuit with Sir John Franklin and the men of his expedition who perished in the 1850s. There were many European ethnographies that would have been available to Tolkien when young. Of these, some were frankly racialist, not just in terms of seeing the Inuit as lower and primitive, but in denying them their very identity. In John Steckley's 2008 book, White Lies About the Inuit, it is revealed that Victorian and Edwardian narratives in the UK and Canada love to speculate about blonde Inuit populations. Blonde Inuit populations, often described as survivors of medieval Viking shipwrecks. Thus, in a 1920 book called Boy Scouts of the North, an Inuit named Sanak is described as different from any of the rest of his tribe. Sanak has blue eyes and hair and beard of a golden red. Similarly, writers such as Edgar Rice Burroughs and H. Rider Haggard specialized in finding lost white cities in Africa where Black people in actuality lived. And Edward Tregear in the Aryan Maori tried to whiten the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tolkien imbibed racialized representations of northern indigenous people, but at least he valued, unlike the blonde Inuit speculators, some measure of cultural integrity. But modern representations of indigenous people were not Tolkien's only conceivable source for the Lossoth. Adam Miyashiro, in a pivotal intervention, has analyzed the character of Grendel in Beowulf as a proto-indigenous figure who unsettles Danish political and social authority. Building on Miyashiro's contention that the idea of indigeneity is pertinent to the world of Beowulf, I would add that even if the poet did not have knowledge of North American indigenous people, which knowledge would require a very late 11th century date for the poem, i.e. after the Norse voyages to Greenland and Vinland, there is nonetheless a possibility of actual indigenous reference in the Beowulf poem. Readers of Beowulf will remember the episode in which Unferth, as Tolkien calls him in Selic Spell, the unfriend at the court of Hrothgar, taunts Beowulf with the knowledge of his brash swimming duel with Brecca. In the duel, Beowulf is alleged to have conducted himself with unheroic showboating. Beowulf repulsed that he showed supreme bravery and stamina in the episode, not only slaying multiple sea beasts, but swimming all the way to Fennaland. It is tempting to read this as denoting, in ethnographic terms, the land dwelled in by the present-day Finns, the people of the Kalevala, the Finno-Ugric speaking Suomi. Yet the Roman historian Tacitus is said to have been speaking of the Sami, the indigenous people called by others Lapps when he spoke of the Fenni. The scholar R.W. Chambers, whose work Tolkien cited in his Monsters and the Critics essay, spoke of Sami cultural contact with the cultural traces of the people described in Beowulf. You could also bring in the Nenets people, also called the Samoyeds, who live up in the northeast corner of the map. In other words, there is a possibility of an Arctic indigeneity referred to on the periphery of the Beowulf poem itself. Thus, Tolkien's invention of the Lossoth as a northern indigenous people on the periphery of the Edain of Western Middle-earth was a calque not just of the world he knew, but the world of his scholarly archive. This is not to say that there could not have been possible influence on him in reading of further people such as the Inuit, who after all had close contact with speakers of the languages Tolkien studied in Greenland. But the idea of northern indigenous people sharing continental space with people phenotypically Western existed both in medieval Europe and in the represented world of Tolkien's Third Age Middle-earth. If, as scholarship on Tolkien's Sigawara essay, such as Brian McFadden's, have reminded us that Tolkien's medieval studies included a somewhat problematic acknowledgement of Black African peoples to the south of his privileged world, there are also non-white indigenous peoples in the north, such as the Sami, Nenets, and Inuit. Dmitri Fimi, who's the most authoritative scholar of race in Tolkien, notes that the Druidain, revealed in unfinished tales as related to at least the people of Ghân-buri-Ghân, are given, quote, childlike, close quote, characteristics. Sami further notes that the racial taxonomy of the era into which Tolkien was born saw indigenous people as automatic and instinctive than whites. Arvedui's attitude to the Lossoth, in which he accepts their help, trusts them with his most cherished possessions, and even for a time genuinely listens to their advice, all the while retaining his own sense of cultural privilege and superior social status, is an example of what Robin Reed has called the invisible whiteness that often characterizes latter-day medievalism, including Tolkien and Tolkien studies. Appendix A to The Lord of the Rings has received relatively little scholarly attention over the years. Before the published Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or the History of Middle-earth volumes existed, the appendices bore all the weight of the Tolkien reader's search for the granularity of what Tolkien himself called the vast backcloths of his world. Later on, stories not only more literarily compelling, but closer to the author's own heart, such as the stories of Beren and Luthien, Turin Turambar, and the Fall of Gondolin, rightly took center stage. Yet the Appendix A material is fascinating, particularly that material set in the 20th and 21st centuries of Middle-earth in the Third Age. I contend, bolstered by Tolkien's use of near future dates in the Notion Club papers, that Tolkien putting the fall of Arthedain in a 20th century, given that the book was written in the 1940s, the near future date of 1975 was making an oblique point that Tolkien was considering issues germane to his own times. Tolkien sets up a contrast between Arvedui, who is willing to listen to indigenous people like the Lossoth, and Eärnur, the Gondorian heir to the throne at that time, who listens to no one, even an elf of the renown of Glorfindel. Which sets up a genealogy of moral luck where Eärnur dies childless, but Arvedui's multiple great-grandson Aragorn gets to ascend the throne of both Gondor and Arnor. And in another project, I'm working on the gender and sexuality implications of Eärnur's childlessness and its opposition to Arvedui's fecundity. But we must remember Arvedui listened incompletely, even though he listened more than Eärnur would have. And his failure to heed the Lossoth's caution about the ship led him to his premature doom. Tolkien's representation of the Lossoth gives visibility to non-Europeans in a manner corollary to the actual historical situation of medieval Europe, which did have indigenous peoples, again, the Sami and the Nenets and the Inuit after the Viking voyages, on what it saw as its peripheries. This forestalls the erasure of indigenous peoples. They're not being represented at all. And Tolkien certainly avoids the extremes of European racist representation, saying these people don't exist, they're not worth being represented, or they're somehow Aryan, Maori, or blonde Inuit, or not really different and there. But nonetheless, the representation of the Lossoth is still encased in what Sami has called a hierarchical world. They remain marginal to the main action and personages of the text. As Tolkien himself admitted in letter 151 to Naomi Mitchison, who was a woman of very different politics than Tolkien and might have been interested in these representational peripheries. Tolkien, though, tells Mitchison that Ice Bay of Foreshell was not cast for any significant part of the book, even as he had by that time envisioned its role in Arvedui's end. Moreover, there is an extra twist in the plot here. As Jess Battis has pointed out, there is another people, the Perianath, called by some the Hobbitlan, even, so I hear, given the odd appellation of hobbits, who are themselves racialized. Since this racialization coincides with an autoethnographic authorial move to see the hobbits as like his posited readers, there is a self-racialization, which by making the self other precludes genuine alterity. So in other words, the hobbits are cutely and goofily other, and that in a way takes care of otherness and prevents us from really glimpsing the other. This can be seen in two very specific details by which the hobbits and Lossoth are paralleled. Firstly, they both fear ships and sea. This both indicates that they understand the association with death the sea has in Tolkien, but also are shy of the Valinor-drawn enlightenment that those beings who essay the sea successfully possess. Secondly, both the hobbits and Lossoth try to aid King Arvedui. Indeed, diegetically, the first thing we hear about Arvedui is in relation to the hobbits coming from the Shire to the Shire under his ancestor Argaleb II, and then Arvedui being succored by a band of hobbit bowmen in the last battle against the Witch King. Both hobbits and Lossoth, in other words, try to aid the nonetheless doomed Arvedui and survive beneath the king's folly, but also having his grandeur. This relativizes away the genuine difference Tolkien achieved in the depiction of the Lossoth by likening them to a people fundamentally depicted as shorter, furrier versions of white Europeans. That being said, rendering non-white people as visible in the sphere of white domination without extreme or visible racism, as Tolkien did in representing the Lossoth, is an achievement. Is that enough? No, it is not enough at all. The representation of the Lossoth still is inhabited by condescension, marginalization, because he only mentions them in this one episode, and white privilege. If, as Ibram X. Kendi has contended, there are no racist or anti-racist people, only racist and anti-racist acts or policies, it might be plausible to say it is the racism or anti-racism of readings of texts which is more of a live question for us than the racism or anti-racism of texts in themselves. This is so even though texts are not people, and the most anti-racist people, the most anti-racist reading cannot make an anti-racist text out of Birth of a Nation or the novels of William Gilmore Simms or Thomas Nelson Page, or that anti-racist readings can only work with what they have. But they can arguably problematize the racism within those texts. With respect in particular to indigeneity, nothing in Tolkien truly speaks to the condition of indigenous people or helps those people to be heard. Several people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, told me that they were very moved upon the release of the Fellowship of the Ring film by Peter Jackson in 2001, that the most poignant moment for them were the Maori words in the credits. This multilingualism coexisted with the multilingualism of the film, its parading of Tolkien's invented language in ways that juxtaposed, but obviously, as Sue Kim's works reminds us, did not parallel or coincide. Similarly, representations of racialized others in Middle-earth remind us of the real thing, but they do not approach it. The presence of the Lossoth in the Third Age of Middle-earth extends even further. The polycultural, polylingual world that Sandra R. Stabhar sees exemplified in the mixed marriages of the Gondorian kings and the northern wild men of Rovanian. And this is all in Appendix A. Indeed, if you look at those 500 years from Third Age 1500 to Third Age 2000 in Appendix A, it's replete with racial signifiers. You have that paradox, particularly the supreme one, Anga Maita and Sanyakando, the great grandsons of Tarkastamir, who flee to the south, and they kind of become the Corsairs of Umbar, but they claim a greater racial purity than the Gondorian kings who have intermarried with the wild white men of the north. But then their descendants, or whoever are the Corsairs of Umbar in The Lord of the Rings, in Third Age 3018, 1,000 years later, are among the most racially othered of the peoples of Middle-earth. And that is a very interesting paradox. This is a point Tolkien reiterated in one of his last letters to Richard Jeffrey, just 8 months before Tolkien's death. What Robin Reed calls the growing awareness of racism as systematic and institutional should not exculpate Tolkien's text from responsibility for the faults and limits of their racial representations. But this awareness does allow for acts of reading, hopefully ever more scrupulous and granular and culturally attuned, that will allow us to try to listen more to excluded voices than Arvedui, last king, was able to do in 1975, Third Age. Let me now unshare my screen so you could see me once more. Stop sharing. And I just want to thank you for listening. And again, I want to honor the Lenape people whose land I am on now, and to encourage people to read along with Tolkien, read Indigenous writers. There are many in North America, Australia, New Zealand. Read those writers as well and enjoy both. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Nick. Okay, yeah, we're going to dive straight into some questions for what really a paper that has been really lighting up the chat box as well. So I think a lot of people really enjoyed that talk. So thank you very much. Okay, so let's get down to it. So first question. Others have mentioned this in the chat, but I was wondering if you had looked at the representation of the Lossoth in the online video game Lord of the Rings Online, and whether it was a sensitive portrayal.
I have not. I have actually never done Lotro. I am aware of Lotro, and when this topic was announced, people told me on Twitter that there was a representation, but I have not looked at it. I will be interested in what people say. I did too. I have a follower, Neocon Sally Rooney Stan, whoever that is on Twitter, who did mention that, and I replied to that follower that the stuff I'm interested in Tolkien recently, like Eornr and the Lossoth and Angiamaicha and Sangiehando, those people show up more in video games than in the criticism. And part of it is what I said in the talk, that this is mainly world building on Tolkien's part. It's stuff he does to flesh out the Lord of the Rings when he is still in the early 1950s, just before it's published, suturing the Lord of the Rings with the earlier Silmarillion material. And he doesn't pay much attention to it after. Later, he goes, my background is Aldarian's ship going to Middle-earth. He does Aldarian and Arendis. He does stuff which is a lot more abstract and literarily powerful and less world-building-y. So I think the fact that the Lossoth are being portrayed in video games, they are picking up on that world-buildingness. But I think we have to pay attention to it on a literary level, precisely because it is in that Appendix A material where he really does simulate the reality of a Europe which has all around it, Europe really being this tiny peninsula jutting out from Asia and Africa, all around it non-white peoples.
Wonderful. And that I think as well what you're saying about kind of like the literary element in comparison to what is ultimately adaptation, as well as that difference between Tolkien's words and then the adaptation and how someone's come to Tolkien as well. Thank you. Okay, so question number 2. Do you think the Lossoth's wisdom in recognizing the danger of the natural world and the less primitive Arvedai's lack of this reflects Tolkien's documented love of the natural world and desire to preserve it, or his fascination with sea storms?
Yeah. Well, so you have part downfall of Númenor there, and part Treebeard and part the Shepherds of the Trees, don't you? So you have catastrophic ecology and sustainable ecology dovetailing. And of course, you could talk about it in terms of climate change as well. I flirted, people talk about the Little Ice Age and the late Middle Ages. I flirted with bringing that in, but decided not to. But yes, I think Tolkien, when Tolkien would look at people like the Lossoth and say, what do I have in common with them? And when he would look at the real life analogs, he would probably say, what I have in common with them is I am trying to preserve and listen to nature. And I am opposing the then very dominant model that we need to extract and shape and industrialize and process the land and not heat it. So that's, I think, where he would see that commonality. Again, it's not enough to make him totally anti-racist, but that commonality is there.
Okay, super, thank you. And a third question. So what do you think about the Grey Havens as this haven overseas meant for people of the Middle Earth? Also, do you have general thoughts on the representation of the Haradrim?
Yeah. The Grey Havens, my only thought has always been my thought, they are so far westward to almost be other, but there also seems to be a question of who has access to them, since there are so many people like the dwarves of the Heirloom and like the Shire people and like the Bree people who are actually very near the Grey Havens, and if they want to access them, they could. So I think that is an interesting anomaly, but they are also an extremity. In terms of the Haradrim, yeah, I think Tolkien intends them as analogs of near Harad is the Arab world and far Harad is the African world. And there are in the siege of Minas Tirith unmistakable echoes of the siege of Constantinople or the siege of Vienna or so on. And they, again, fantasy fiction has been trying to get itself out from under that ever since. I do think, again, that paradox I noted with the ancestry of the Corsairs of Umbar, people who actually leave Gondor because this Vinatharia, this half-barbarian Vinatharia is the king, and then they take over and become purer than the pure. Again, if I was to read anything critical, anything anti-racist in the representation of the Haradrim, I would say that, and of course, you all know the scene in the Two Towers where Sam sees the fallen warrior and says, "This guy had a life too and feelings too," and it is an empathetic, somewhat intersectional moment there. But yeah, again, the scholarship on the Sigawara land essay, of course, Tolkien's original name for the Haradrim, or a name he considered, was the Sun Harrowers, the Sun Harrow land, and that is clear from that Sigawara essay that he is extracting from that. And there has been work on that is talking about Tolkien and kind of racism towards people of the South.